Hey family, welcome back to my video. Today we will see, what if Harry Potter was raised by Death Eater Sirius Black? I would like to extend my sincere thanks to the original author of this story for granting us permission to use it in our YouTube video. Your generosity is greatly appreciated. The author's creation and the original stories link in the descriptions. Please do check that first. Now enjoy the video. Summary: The right choice by elenatark. Sirius becomes a Death Eater as a spy for Dumbledore, in which his family's blood purist ideals remained with Sirius throughout the years, and his loyalties only ever lied with his best friend rather than the Order itself. Or, 13-year-old Harry becomes the ward of might have or might not have been a Death Eater Lord Black, and ends up learning the name of that one Slytherin kid in his year. To be changed. Chapter notes: Sirius is a blood purist without really meaning to be one. A lot of self-justification, mixed in with a whole bunch of one-sided pining after James without even realizing he's obsessing over him. See the end of the chapter for more notes. August 1979. No, James is adamant in this as he is about all things when it comes to Sirius. It warms Sirius's heart, even if this does make things a lot more difficult for all of them. James: absolutely not. Tears prick at the corners of Sirius's eyes, but despite this, the tentative smile he gives is genuine. He never would have known what it meant to trust and be trusted, love and be loved, had it not been for the messy-haired kid on the train who slammed into him and staggered away with a stupid grin on his face. James Potter took a chance for Sirius which would change the course of his life forever. After all these years, it is time that Sirius proves to them both that James made the right choice back then. Sirius will give up his freedom and his friends to fight for the cause that James taught him to believe in the best way that he is able. You're not going. We can tell Dumbledore to use someone else, anyone else. You will not put your neck on the line like this. It's the best advantage we have. Sirius sighs, insisting even though it hurts him too. Imagine what the Order could accomplish with information from a member of his inner circle. And that isn't even to mention what details the heir to the House of Black could come across. You hate that place, Padfoot. James's voice wavers. You hate them. You'd be giving up your whole life for this. And in return, saving the lives of all those you taught me to value. Sirius places his hands on James's shoulders. He doesn't know where he would be had James given up on him at any point in their lives. Sirius was so clueless when he first entered the dormitory of the house he had mindlessly followed his beaming new friend into, with thoughts of panic vaguely swirling in his mind as to how Mother would react to his sorting. He hadn't put much thought into his words as he'd carelessly let slip, Mudblood, when referring to their shabby dorm mate with the muggle clothes. James could have chosen right then and there to lead all of Gryffindor House in shunning Sirius, alienating him and driving him right back into his family's arms. And yet he had only clenched his jaw, calmly told Sirius to step outside with him, and explained to him in the earnest and determined way that only an 11-year-old could, why it was wrong of Sirius to use that word. They'll hurt you, James mumbles feebly. I don't want you to get hurt. I'm still a Black, you know. Sirius tries for a weak smile. The royalty of magical Britain. The pride of pureblood aristocracy. I'm untouchable. Sarcasm dripping off his words because it is what James expects to hear. Never mind Sirius's secret pride regarding the matter. They won't get to me unless I let them. James sniffles, his eyes red and vulnerable in a way only a person as coddled in childhood as he was would ever let show. I'm going to miss you, he says quietly, clasping Sirius in a tight embrace. I'm glad you were able to tell me, at least. And what a load of bargaining that took. Dumbledore kept emphasizing the importance of discretion when he came to Sirius with this proposition, but he eventually had to acknowledge that Sirius would never be convinced if it meant leading his closest friend to believe the worst of him. Dumbledore is wise like that, though Sirius doubts even the headmaster was observant enough to realize it is not the Order's cause Sirius follows, but whichever cause James fights for. Sirius has no one and nothing except the boy who showed him the world is bigger than what he once believed it to be. If James were to flip sides tomorrow, Sirius would trail after him and accept the dark mark with open arms, just as he chose Gryffindor for James all those years ago. We'll be drinking and laughing about this moment right now one day. Sirius laughs instead of crying like he wants to, because one of them has to be the strong one here, and James has already broken down halfway anyway. He returns James's embrace one last time. "Thank you," Sirius whispers into James's hair, "for everything." The same time the next morning, Sirius is walking up the steps of Grimmauld Place, no longer the wild Gryffindor runaway he was when he was here last. Gone are his muggle clothes and defiant rebellious pride. Standing before the doors of his ancestral home, it is far easier than he had thought it would be to slip into the mask of Heir Black, first son to the most powerful and ancient family in all of magical Britain. Years have passed in his absence, but Sirius Orion Black has returned at last to reclaim his rightful throne. To this day, Regulus remembers the gala from when he was 13 years old. It was the first one he was ever allowed to attend, and he was terrified out of his mind that he would make a fool of himself. It turned out he need not have worried, however, for when he stepped into the room, no one bothered to spare him a glance. Not because his status as the spare to the House of Black was unimpressive by any means, but simply because of the weak way in which he carried himself. Mother was always telling him how proud he should be to be a Black, that Blacks were superior to everyone in every way, but it was hard to conduct himself with the pride befitting his name when it was so easy to become self-conscious around all these far more accomplished and powerful men and women. Even at school, Regulus tended to fade into the background, which spoke wonders about his inadequacy as a potential heir, seeing as his peers were always happy to allow him the limelight for his bloodline alone. So Regulus kept to the shadows. He observed, rather than participated in, the interactions that took place among magical Britain's finest. Full of arrogance, all of them, each too engrossed in their own conversations to pay attention to those outside their little circles. And yet, every last one of them turned, every last one of them sensed the shift in the air, when the doors to the ballroom opened once more to allow him inside. Sirius exuded confidence like it was second nature to him, effortlessly navigating the crowd that surged to him and greeting father's guests with the most charming smiles. Regulus simply stood there, bewildered, for he knew better than anyone how loud Sirius could get when he was complaining about not wishing to be the heir. Was all that just a cry for attention? It seemed impossible that the Sirius who protested against heir lessons so adamantly could have put in the effort of preparing himself enough to carry himself like a radiant star across the ballroom. It was as Regulus lay in his bed that night that it finally clicked. Sirius hadn't prepared for anything at all. He did indeed hate his title of Heir Black with great passion, and had therefore shown up to the ball and wandered about with no particular thought to his actions. That, all of it, the charm, the allure, the inexplicable sense of reverence that everyone had felt in waves, had been a product of Sirius's carelessness. Regulus understood now why Bellatrix had stopped with her furious complaints of having the title of heir stolen away from her after Sirius's first ball. There was no question about it. Sirius had been born to be the Black Heir. And Regulus realized right then with certainty that there could be no disaster too terrible in the world that would ever deny Sirius the right to that. February 1980. Lord Voldemort has always prided himself on his collections. When he was young and knew nothing of the world he would one day rule, it was smooth pebbles of pale gray plucked out from the sea. Small prizes and possessions stolen away from the children who angered him. Years later, once he found his footing in the society to which he belonged, it was collecting the sons of nobility who came to him for protection, for glory, for lessons in the most refined forms of cruelty. Soon after came his quest for immortality, gathering artifacts from the founders of the only home he had ever known. And now, a lifetime later, he lords over his greatest collection, yet a coven of the darkest and most dangerous that magical Britain has to offer. To his right, in Rodolphus's absence tonight, is Lucius Malfoy, having taken up the mantle his cowardly father refused to accept with determined vigor, bloodthirsty in the way that Abraxas never could be. To his left, Bellatrix Lestrange, devoted as she is fanatical, and unmatched by the rest here in terms of raw power. More desperate than ever to prove her worth ever since the summer, when the cousin whose shadow she had only just escaped from effortlessly climbed the ranks that she fought life and limb for to achieve. Voldemort had thought he knew what to expect of the Black Heir when first hearing of his request to receive his mark. A ploy on Dumbledore's part, surely, a laughably transparent one at that. Voldemort had accepted Black's supposed loyalty with a bit of entertainment in mind, feeding false information to the Order's spy, perhaps, and when Voldemort had grown tired of the game, he would reward Bellatrix by allowing her to decide her cousin's fate. Naturally, it had been a mild surprise to learn that Black, who had been made to start off as a foot soldier like the rest of the new recruits, had begun climbing the ranks at speeds unheard of since Bellatrix, by way of the most delightfully darkest spells known in existence. But of course Sirius Black was skilled in the dark arts, Voldemort reasoned. He was a Black, after all. Truly, Dumbledore was losing his touch if he thought this would be reason enough for Voldemort to trust the Black heir. Black was undoubtedly reveling in getting to curse so many Death Eaters behind the guise of training. It would all change, Voldemort was sure, once this most intriguing recruit was sent out into action. I have never witnessed such a thing, Thaddeus informed him the night of Black's first raid. Thaddeus, not one of very few left alive capable of connecting Voldemort's name to that of the dirt-poor Muggle orphan boy from decades past, and the only person whom Voldemort very occasionally permitted a lack of reverential worship from. He split the Cruciatus between 3 Order members. A reflective fusion spell of some kind, or perhaps it was a combination of runes of his own creation, I must ask after that. So Black had no qualms about turning his wand against members of the Order. That still did not mean he was not a spy. But perhaps where Black's loyalties lay should not matter so much, not if he was willing to curse Dumbledore's soldiers with such deadly precision either way. It would be unwise of Voldemort to keep Black as a foot soldier for much longer, if not for his magical prowess, then for his political power. And Voldemort had to admit that he was intrigued, to say the least. Which was how Heir Black had been invited to the meeting of the Inner Circle today, and judging from Bellatrix's howl of fury, the man in question had just arrived. Dressed from head to toe in plain but clearly expensive wizarding robes, as befitting a servant of a Dark Lord who also happened to be the future Lord Black. Carrying himself with confidence and certainty that he was better than most others here, but holding his arrogance back just before his claim on power could touch Voldemort's. So many other small details whose cleanly cut precision should have Voldemort suspecting hours and hours spent debating, calculating movements, yet he was met with the most bizarre impression that none of these dangerously made choices had been deliberate on Black's part. But no one could really be so natural in the art of subtle manipulations, could they? Even Voldemort required himself to measure his own movements from time to time, for there was always the irritating danger of one too many Cruciatus curses driving away a certain number of his followers to the other side. Whatever it was, at least Sirius Black was already shaping up to be far more interesting than his disappointment of a brother. Perhaps Bellatrix was at fault for giving Voldemort such high hopes for what to expect of another Black, but Regulus Black had turned out to be such a terribly easy person to overlook. Your reports, Rabaston? And thus, the meeting began. Obviously, Voldemort was not planning on letting any significant plans slip in Black's presence, so he simply listened to the reports without comment and had the next person make theirs. The McKinnons were still refusing to join his side, as were the Greengrasses. He would have to pay a personal visit to the former later, for at least Lord Greengrass followed in Lucius's example when it came to the Wizengamo's votes. The Aurors Longbottom were taking a leave of absence, unexpectedly good news. Corbin looked giddy with excitement to have been able to deliver that one. The double doors to the room flew open abruptly, and within 2 seconds, Severus Snape had a dozen wands aimed for the top of his head. The young man hardly seemed to notice, however, what with the way he was heaving like he'd just fought a manticore. Will you be doing us the favor of dropping dead of your own accord, Snivellus, or will I be given the pleasure of doing it for you? Severus's head snapped up at once. On the rare occasions that Voldemort personally spoke with him, Severus Snape was always brooding and full of such lifeless resentment at the world that Voldemort had wondered if his nature might be used as a standard model for what the ideal Inferius should be. Now, however, none of that bitterness at life was to be seen, and only the most fervent of hatred remained. Voldemort had been right in summoning Black to this meeting, as he was in all things. The entertainment for tonight was turning out to be quite the treat. You! Severus screamed with loathing. All thoughts of the reason he'd risked his life and sanity by barging into the room unannounced seemingly flying straight out of his mind. But of course, he would not have known to expect Black. Only those of the Inner Circle were privy to the identities of the Death Eaters, a necessary precaution that proved its worth on the occasions the lower-ranking ones were captured by the Order. The rest of the time, during training and raids and such, they wore masks and glamours to hide who they were. You're here? Severus demanded. You expect anyone here to believe that you're A.A. A what? A killer? Black replied coolly. You seem to have no trouble accusing me of being one in our school years. Granted, I did deserve that one, didn't I? Though if I could go back, I'd just finish the job myself then drag the others into it. Now this, Voldemort would have to hear about later on. But first, there was the matter of deciding how many minutes Severus should spend writhing under the Cruciatus for daring to interrupt their meeting. Severus seemed to sense the shift in the air, for he pulled away from Black at once and prostrated himself on the ground at Voldemort's feet. "My lord," he rasped, "Dumbledore has just been delivered a prophecy, one that determines the outcome of the war." And the utter fool, the stupid, thoughtless, irrational imbecile, blurted out the rest before Voldemort could tell him to hold his wretched tongue while they were still in the presence of so many others. "The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies." Silence descended upon the room as each of the Death Eaters looked to Voldemort with trepidation, wondering how their lord would react to the words of fate, and which of them would be made to pay for it. "Who does it apply to?" Voldemort asked softly, to no one in particular, and after a tense moment of contemplation, answers came rushing forward at once. "The McKinnons and the Prewetts have defied you thrice, my lord." "McKinnon is not pregnant, you imbecile, and neither Prewetts are married but my lord, the Longbottoms." "The Longbottoms, yes, that must be the reason for their leave of absence. The McKinnons could still apply if we are to take blood adoptions into account. The prophecy was very specific, Atticus, born to those who have thrice defied the Potters." Eyes turned to Lord not at his quiet but resonating words. Only Voldemort did not stare too closely at him, for he was busy observing the way that Black had grown still in his seat. Finally, a crack in the perfect facade. "The Potters can't apply," Bellatrix scowled. "They have only ever directly defied our Lord on 2 occasions. Once, during the attack on Cornwall, and twice, the night of Gideon Prewett's capture." Instead of paying the Black Witch any mind, Thaddeus turned to Voldemort instead and had the gall to cock a questioning brow at him. "The Potters apply," Voldemort conceded. Thaddeus had enough tact left about him not to openly state the reason behind this, at least. Keeping the balance of politics in the midst of a war was a fragile thing. After decades of playing the purebloods game to make them dance to his tune, Voldemort really ought to have known better. Never at any point in his life had he believed in pureblood supremacy, not really, when he himself was a half-blood and therefore knew that half-bloods were in all ways superior to the rest. He could have just as easily sided with the mudbloods as he did with the purebloods, but only one of the two parties had unlimited access to vast magical resources and political powers, so it was his Slytherin lineage that Tom Marvolo Riddle had chosen to embrace. After all, a Muggle-raised orphan in Slytherin House hardly had the luxury of openly offering alliances to mudbloods as the Dark Lord Grindelwald had been doing at the time, and the agenda had inevitably stuck. Unfortunate, really, as there were far more Wixen connected to the Muggles than not, which meant Voldemort had ended up having to alienate an entire group of people from the start. Then there had been the matter of those few noteworthy mudbloods he had come across in his long lifetime, Lily Evans being the most memorable of them all. Even now, Slughorn, the old fool, still did not realize it, but he had been greatly assisting the Death Eaters with their recruitment prospects for years. Every year without delay, the potions master would pick out the candidates best served for politics, as well as the ones with extreme intelligence and magical prowess. In other words, the perfect prospective Death Eaters. Meeting with the mudblood prodigy of the age, the very title that Slughorn had once bestowed upon a particularly skilled Muggle-raised Slytherin long ago, had been too intriguing of an opportunity to pass up. Years ago, Voldemort had broken through Potter Cottage's wards and had made both Potters an offer on the spot. But the noble idiots had refused, not even having the foresight to at least pretend to go along with Voldemort's proposition, and so they had dueled. It had been the most exhilarating experience Voldemort had had in some time. James Potter, so creative was he with his skills in transfiguration, amusing Voldemort with spells one hardly ever came across in the battlefield yet managing to work lethal wonders with them all the same. Lily Potter, her natural talent in charms and potions having extended into her mastery of the defensive arts. And when she had caught him off guard with an artful weave of dark magic, allowing for her husband's and her own escape, Voldemort had been more mildly entertained than furious at their escape. But sitting here amidst arguments over a prophecy predicting his downfall, Voldemort now knew that it had been wrong of him to allow their escape at all. Despite the many names that were put forth, Voldemort already knew which pair it was that would become parents to this prophesied hero child. Heir Black. The shouting died down at once. Sirius Black shifted his dead eyes off the table and straightened up slightly at the sound of his title. You will return to the Order. Make up some lie about how you were planning on reverting back once you had gathered enough information from us. Voldemort was not so stupid as to think for a moment this could not very well be the current case. But no leader ever put a double agent in place with the expectations that they would truly remain loyal to his side. They were only there as a means of flitting information back and forth between the two parties, for to keep up the ruse of spy, the leaders on both sides were required to occasionally feed the other something useful through them. At least by making Black a double agent rather than keeping him as a potentially traitorous soldier, Voldemort would be getting something out of it. Dumbledore will be placing the most powerful protections on the home of the prophesied child. You will grow close enough to the Potters once more so that when the time inevitably comes for a secret keeper to be chosen for the Fidelius, you will be allowed the honor, or at the very least, be able to tell us the identity of the keeper in question. Yes, my lord, Black replied, and had Voldemort not seen the flicker of panic in Black's eyes in the brief second following Thaddeus's remark, there was a real chance he would have fallen for Black's act of indifference. Hours later, after the members of his inner circle had departed with direct orders not to target neither the Longbottom nor the Potter family, Voldemort was approached by two of his own privately, on separate accounts. Severus, the mudblood-loving fool, groveled for Lily Potter to be spared. After giving the man a lengthy dose of the Cruciatus for daring to approach him with a request on the very same night he had come to them with such terrible news, Voldemort agreed to allow Lily Potter her life. He wasn't sure if he would end up bothering to keep that promise, but at least agreeing for now would get Severus to stop crawling around at his feet. It was pathetic, truly. Voldemort expected the visit that came next, for no matter the recent change in hearts, no matter the sudden alleged shift in ideals, Black couldn't have possibly faked being James Potter's best friend all these years, especially not as an 11-year-old with no thoughts of future wars in mind. Voldemort was glad to see that Black came with a smidge more dignity than Severus had, at least. He walked in with his head held high, oozing the signature confidence of any Black, but with his gaze dropped below the level of Voldemort's, displaying the appropriate amount of subordination. My lord, I have come to ask that you reconsider your plans of attack on the Potters. Reconsider your plans. So indirect, and for what? Yet Black had managed to keep his attention thus far, and so Voldemort would play along until that change. You would see that the child prophesied to be my downfall be permitted to live? For the very first time, Black hesitated. As he was not stupid, he undoubtedly knew how unreasonable that particular request would be. Spare him. James. He is a pureblood, an Auror, and the current Lord Potter. He would be a good soldier and a useful political ally. All very good points. The very reasons Voldemort had tried to recruit him in the first place, in fact. But there was just one small problem in this plan of Black's. Somehow, I very much doubt Lord Potter will be willing to join me when our meeting will be marked by the death of his son and wife. I can convince him, my lord. With the wife and the child gone, I will be the only family he has left, and to the Potters, family is everything. And you yourself would not mind the death of the witch and the boy? There was unexpected bitterness in Black's eyes as he answered this. She took him from me. I would, it would be a tragedy, of course. But I would understand that some sacrifices had to be made. This was followed by a very rare occasion of Voldemort wondering if he had made a mistake in judgment. The subtle urgency behind Black's words suggested that he felt almost possessive of James Potter, in some way. Try as he might, Voldemort could not sense a sliver of distress when Black spoke of Lily Potter and her unborn child. Could it truly be possible that Black had no loyalties to the Order, and instead only to James Potter? An endless stretch of advantageous possibilities spread out before Voldemort in an instant. James Potter will be spared, Voldemort agreed, and unlike the one he had made to Severus, he fully intended to honor this promise. Take your leave, Heir Black. Return with the locations of the Potters, and you will be rewarded with this. With a respectful bow, the man who seemingly had no care for the lives of those other than James Potters, turned and marched out of the room. Voldemort had accepted Black's presence on a whim, but it would seem that his choice would be bringing to him not one, but two loyal new followers instead. Voldemort was a fool. She took him from me, honestly. Sirius knew the aberration of a creature parading around as a lord would accept such claims of possession far better than any tales of purist ideologies Sirius could have spun up. Selfishness was something any Dark Lord would understand. Heartless beings like Voldemort didn't understand that there were things worth more than one's own happiness. That to see one who was the other half of one's soul so happy, so blissful, when they were with another, it was a sacrifice worth making 1,000 times over, no matter one's own feeling of loss. Lily made James happy, and that had been all that Sirius had needed to accept her as their own. There were still the occasional conflicts, of course. Lily was a Muggleborn, and while Sirius was under no illusions that Muggle blood meant lesser power in the magics, he was not so naive as James was to believe that Muggleborns and purebloods could ever coexist in mutual understanding. How could they, when the very cultures that they had been raised on were so different? Yes, purebloods sneered at the Muggleborns for their lack of common knowledge, but the Muggleborns always sneered right back, scoffing at the backwards traditions of the wizarding world. Even Lily, perfect Lily, whose presence could brighten up James's days even in the worst of times, joked about the impracticality of everything traditional, from quills to fire calls even now. Magic was just as wondrous for people like her as it was for people like them, yet they who had been raised on tales of magic beans and cackling witches had their own idea of what magic was supposed to be. Lily would make fun of the backwardness of using quills, scoff at the marriage traditions of pureblood families, and James, Sirius, and Marlene would all laugh along with her, agreeing with her Muggle ideals, simply because Muggleborns were the minority and it was only right that powerful purebloods like them aided the disadvantaged like her. Sirius had only ever voiced these opinions to James once, back in their school days. Afterwards, James had refused to talk to Sirius for 3 days straight. To this day, Sirius was not sure what it was he'd done so wrong, but desperate as he'd been to have James back in his life, he'd sworn never to speak that way again, whatever it was that way was, and apologized to James a million times over. Sirius never apologized to anyone. He was a black, and blacks never apologized. Obviously, he had fully accepted that it was stupid to discriminate based on blood, but the fact remained that blacks were superior to all those in their world. Not for their purity, of course, but for their great lineage itself. Hundreds of ancestors, spanning generations, his family line capable of being traced back to when magic was a deity and wands were a thing of the far-off future. It was only natural that others bowed to them, that those of House Black never apologized. But wonderful, perfect, blindingly bright James Potter had always been the exception to every rule. Apparently, Sirius's devotion to James was so great that even Voldemort had heard about it, and so convinced was he that Sirius's obsession for James could overrule all else, that he easily bought the lie about Sirius not caring for Lily and Harry, which was preposterous. Obviously, Lily was the center of James's universe, and while Sirius had resented that in his adolescence, he appreciated it now. Whomever James loved, Sirius loved too, and when the baby came, Sirius would love him as well. Especially him. Lily was under Sirius's protection by extension of James, but Harry would be half of James himself. Sirius would sooner attempt to maul Voldemort's neck as Padfoot than allow him to take one threatening step in the direction of the Potters. Back from kneeling for the filth so soon, his mother sneered when he returned to Grimmauld Place. Always Grimmauld Place, never home, in Sirius's head, for home was where the heart was, and his heart remained with James even now, as it always would. "Good morning to you as well, Mother," Sirius replied, the perfect son, the perfect heir, fully aware that for some bizarre reason, his cool indifference towards her actually riled her up more than when he'd been a screaming teenager throwing tantrums in her midst. "As I have told you once already, I would rather you didn't say things in my presence that you would not be willing to announce to the whole public." And of course, the mighty Walburga Black would never dare speak of the half-blood she had once attended school with, not in these dangerous times. She'd alluded to it enough times for Sirius to connect the dots, however, but even before that, he and the other Order members had received direct confirmation from Dumbledore that all was not as it seemed when it came to Voldemort's past. Initially, when he had returned home, Sirius's mother had been wary of his intentions. A natural reaction, one shared by his many relatives, all of them wary and suspicious and none of them stupid enough to believe he'd only returned because he'd run out of money, as the rest of elite society had been so quick to believe at the time. These were all aunts and uncles and cousins that had known Sirius since he'd come out of the womb. They knew how stubborn he could get, and were fully aware that he would have sooner starved to death than admit defeat by poverty and return for gold from where he'd fled. She made him choose, he had explained coldly, detachedly. The mudblood did not approve of the company I kept. We could deal with our differences in culture before, we each knew what lines not to cross, but after the incident with Rosier, Evan Rosier, whom his family would be able to confirm had been sighted in Sirius's company on occasion, for Sirius, unaware at the time that Rosier was a Death Eater, had been speaking with him to ask how Regulus was doing. Rosier was unmasked in the attack on St. Catchpole last year, as you will recall. One of the Mudblood's friends ended up as a casualty of the destruction. She and Potter had a tremendous fight over it, and she made him choose between myself and her. These lies were along the same lines of whatever nonsense he'd spouted to Voldemort tonight. So focused was Sirius on subtly observing the expressions of his family, that it would be only later on that he realized how frighteningly easy it had been to slip back into his old tongue, how effortless it had been to speak in that bitter, sneering, careless tone that they would expect, all while allowing a trickle of vulnerability and hurt to seep through. But then again, he had always been a good liar, hadn't he? Always capable of coming up with false tales and excuses on the spot, pinning the blame of broken vases and empty bottles on his older cousins at a moment's notice. And who would suspect him, anyway? Who would even dare to think of berating the black heir, the perfect heir, so flawless in everything that he could never be capable of anything that was not meant to be? Contrary to his fears, when he had sorted Gryffindor, congratulations had poured in from all around. All his relatives were thoroughly convinced that the scandalous results of his sorting simply had to be a part of a much larger plan. And hadn't that been a shock? After that, for the first time in his life, Sirius began to toe the lines he had once believed would be disastrous to cross. It was clear enough that he had some unknown power over his family, for them to believe he could do no wrong, and over the years, he began to test the limits, to see if there was one at all. Associating with James Potter, wealthy pureblood heir, would not have been much cause for gossip, blood traitor though his family was. The insignificant Peter Pettigrew could be overlooked as well, his blood being pure. But associating with half-bloods like Remus Lupin? Daring to be seen speaking with the mudbloods of Gryffindor House? But no. Howlers came, no reprimands from his family, who simply turned a blind eye to his questionable company and instead looked only when he was bullying his fellow students, all of whom delightfully just happened to be half-bloods and never purebloods. Yet that had never been intentional on Sirius's part. Sure, he might have directed James's antics off of boys like Avery and Parkinson from time to time, shifting their pranks onto lesser, insignificant gnats like Snape and Davis instead, but that had nothing to do with blood purity and reputation at all. Powerless Davis with his blood traitor parents was simply more annoying than the rest. Half-blooded Snape with his muggle name was so much more amusing to go after than the others. Sirius was nothing like his family, he hated them, and didn't he prove he didn't think he was higher than his fellow Gryffindors and all that nonsense when he quietly or as quietly as a marauder could be, anyway accepted the detentions McGonagall dished out to them, rather than bring his family name into the picture and threaten to get her fired when he was demanded to scrub cauldrons? It's black, Gideon no, Fabian either one of the Pruitt twins exclaim, drawing their wands on him at once when he shows up at Order headquarters. Sirius amuses himself by allowing them to disarm him and drag him to Dumbledore, and it's worth it to see their furious faces drop in surprise when the leader of the Order informs them that brave Sirius, Honorable Sirius, has been putting himself at risk this whole time by acting as a spy in Voldemort's ranks. Sirius! Marlene shrieks, throwing herself at him, before promptly punching him hard in the ribs, then embracing him again. But her warm welcome is nothing compared to James, who flows in not a moment after a Patronus is sent out to inform him of Sirius's return. Sirius cannot enjoy it for long, however, no matter how much he has missed this, the bond between his brother, his soulmate, for there is a reason he has come back, and a grievous one at that. He's coming after your unborn son, Sirius blurts out, unable to keep it in any longer. Indeed, Dumbledore sighs gravely. A recently turned spy of Voldemort's informed me of this just last night. A prophecy has been made of Voldemort's downfall, and the future Potter and Longbottom heirs are the only ones that could apply. That was fast, Sirius thinks, and is rather impressed that Dumbledore has another spy in Voldemort's inner circle other than him. After all, the meeting was only held hours ago, the revelation brought to light only when Snivellus burst into the room. Who could it be? Sirius can't imagine any of the stone-cold Death Eaters being a secret order spy, but then again, it's not like his family ever went back to suspecting him of holding traitorous ideals once he got the dark mark. Oh, they were plenty disapproving about the matter, sneering at him, a Black, for lowering himself to that filth, but what could they do? He was heir Black, and with father nearing his death and grandfather aging away in the countryside, he was the head of their family. At any rate, his dark mark proved he had truly let go of his blood traitor ways, and daily reminders of the perfect heir that Sirius used to be had them warming back up to him in no time. It was almost suspiciously too easy, actually, how quickly he'd managed to convince them. Perhaps they knew something that he didn't, as was the case with old people. Go into hiding. I know the borders have been closed at the moment, but I sneak you out of the country regardless. Voldemort knows they will try to flee to foreign lands, just as he undoubtedly knew you would be giving us this information before the sun had fully risen, Dumbledore murmured. We must hide them here, in Britain, with the greatest protections imaginable. Stay with us, James and Lily say, days later, when Sirius tries to leave for the Fidelius to be cast. They speak of how dangerous it will be for Sirius to return to Voldemort, that Sirius will be the first the Death Eaters will hunt down once the existence of the Fidelius charm has been discovered. But that's the whole point. That's why Sirius is doing this. He will be the distraction that saves James's life, and if Sirius dies in the process, then it will be worth it. The best way to go, really. Anything for James. We'll make it through this, James promises him, his pampered childhood still shining through in the way he knows not that promises shouldn't be made for the sake of comfort alone. We'll survive this war, you'll see. Harry will grow up knowing his Uncle Padfoot, and everything will be as it was before. Already, Sirius knows this is certainly a vision that will not come into fruition. Even if, by some miracle, the Death Eaters are defeated, there will be no going back to the life of Gryffindor camaraderie and Marauders reunions. Remus left them a year ago, suspecting Sirius of being a Death Eater long before he actually received the mark. Their friends from school are growing sparser in population, either going into hiding or getting themselves killed in battle. And then there is Sirius himself. In returning to the circle of blood purists, he has returned to his family. Try as he might, he cannot escape the thrill of knowing that they, in father and grandfather's absence, look to him as a leader, as he was born to be, a stark difference to how he is just another soldier in the order, and a highly mistrusted one at that. He left more in fear than hatred the night that he broke his mother's wretched heart, family loyalties shifting when it was declared that Orion Black would not live long enough to see the next year. The pressure of leading an entire house, pushed so suddenly onto a 16-year-old's shoulders was too much to bear, and his mother's emotional screams made it all that much easier for him to flee. But Sirius has grown since then, from the terrified boy of the past to the young man that he is now. He now knows that his family will accept him despite how he ran, the one crime that they still have not forgiven him for, that very limit he'd adventurously searched for in his school years. He abandoned them, yet in a time of need, they know as well as he that there is only one who can lead them, and it is most certainly not Regulus, no matter what she liked to claim. In the world they live in, there is no escaping one's roots, and for the House of Black, whose roots run deeper than any family in the wizarding world, there was ever only one way that this could end. Thank you. Sirius whispers the same words he spoke last year, as he left James for an uncertain future. Now, however, the future is clear. Either he will die as Padfoot, the boy James Potter believed could be saved, or he will live on as heir Black, in a world where Voldemort has been defeated and the Muggleborns protected. A world where the future Lord of House Black will have no business associating with blood traitors like the Potters. This isn't goodbye, I swear it, James insists. Hold on to that innocence, Sirius prays. To see good where others see none, it is the best part of you. Cherish it. Take care of them, Sirius rasps, turning to James and Lily's chosen secret keeper. The natural choice, really, considering Remus's absence and how easily Voldemort can access Sirius. Peter nods fervently from where he stands by the doorway. I won't let you down, he vows. Sweet Peter, always here with them, always the reliable one. For taking on this great risk, Sirius embraces and thanks him too. Chapter end notes wrote this FIC cuz one-sided Sirius. James always made so much sense to me. James opened up Sirius's eyes to a whole new world and showed him there was a path other than simply blindly following his family along. So of course Sirius would have been grateful for that. But add in a manic black flare and it turns into obsession, to the point where it's not much of a stretch to think it was solely for James that Sirius chose the Order's side, not because he'd had any particular change of heart in beliefs. I might possibly continue on with this FIC with a second part of 12 years later. Sirius raising Harry, Harry becoming the ward of House Black, etc. Smiley face. To be saved chapter notes, see the end of the chapter for notes. 13 years later. Come back in here, come back and put her right. Harry had blown up his aunt. Not his aunt. His aunt's husband's sister. His cousin's aunt. She deserved it. She deserved what she got. You keep away from me. He was 13 years old, and he had just run away from home. Not home. Just the house he lived in during the summers. I'm going. I've had enough. Harry was doomed. He was going to get arrested and sent to Azkaban. Not Azkaban. They probably wouldn't chuck a kid into Azkaban, but he was most certainly going to get expelled. He senses it rather than hears it. Someone or something, standing in the narrow gap between the garage and the fence behind him. Lumos, he whispers, because what's a bit more illegal magic if he's going to get his wand snapped anyway? Harry sees, quite distinctly, the hulking outline of something very big, with wide, gleaming eyes. He steps backward, legs hitting his trunk and he trips. His wand flies out of his hand as he flings out an arm to break his fall, and he lands, hard, in the gutter. Bang! 5 minutes later, Harry is on what he's told is called the night bus and zooming through the streets of Muggle London at what could quite possibly be the speed of light. Thundering down a narrow country lane, trees leaping out of the way, yet Harry manages to keep just enough wits about him to notice the eerily familiar face of a man blinking at him from the front page of the conductor's copy of the Daily Prophet. That man, Harry frowns, still unable to place the face. He has the eeriest sense that he has seen him before. Do you know who he is? Sirius Black. Stanley scowls, immediately flipping the paper over so that he can properly glare at the front page. Finally released from house arrest as if you can even call it that, earn. Bloody Rick folk and their posh manners. Ministry might as well, Avenue sent. I am off to live in 'em fancy tropical islands. For all the suffering, EGOT. Why don't tell me you don't know who Sirius Black is, Neville. He adds, glancing at the blank look on Harry's face, putting into use the fake name that Harry gave in a pathetic attempt to avoid the ministry for now. You oughta read 'em history books more. Stanley offers Harry the paper, and Harry curiously begins to read away. Lord of House Black returns to Wizarding Society at last. Sirius Black, current Lord to the House of Black and the only court representative with 3 inherited seats on the Wizengamot, has been released from his 12 years long period of house arrest as of midnight this Saturday. Immediately after his ban was lifted, he is reported to have marched into the Ministry of Magic with demands made to members of the Department of Family Relations and Child Welfare. Black, notorious for the allegations made against him for having been a pivotal leader of the Death Eaters terrorist movement, was held responsible for the deaths of 13 people with a single burst of accidental magic. 13 people. Harry stares in disbelief. With accidental magic? That can't be possible. Course it ain't possible, Neville, Stanley grimaces. You'll soon learn that the world ain't as fair as people like making it out to be. Harry knows this, of course. Just a few months ago, he watched as a man responsible for the near death of a little girl and the petrification of half a dozen innocents was allowed to walk away with only the price of freeing an elf. Yet even so, an attempt at passing off 13 deaths as accidental seems a bit extreme. And that's coming from Harry, who is the most likely person to sympathize with bouts of disastrous accidental magic at the moment. Couldn't have been possible if you weren't a Black, me mum used to say. Stanley nods. Not even the poshest names you can think of could have managed it, not with the way E was caught cackling like mad at the scene of the crime. But you know 'em Blacks, they stand out even in the 28, practically built the world we stand on, things like that. Managed to paint it off as grief, Merlin's sake. They still add to punish I am for those deaths, what with the fear o' the war still lingerin' and everything, so they said? He wasn't at fault for it, but he was still volatile and should be shut up in his castle, shite like that. Harry, too clueless to be able to keep up with everything Stanley is saying, only manages to catch one word properly. Grief? He repeats. Grief for Potters. James and Lily Potter, you know. Honestly, Neville, don't you, haven't you a parent who taught you these things? Harry's mind goes numb at the names. Vividly, he recalls one of the photographs from the album Hagrid gifted him years ago, and manages to match a name to a face. Laughing at his parents' wedding, smiling up at the camera with an arm hooked around Harry's mum and dad each. The Death Eater, Sirius Black. 100 questions are spinning through Harry's head at once. What does any of this mean? Did his parents not know Sirius Black was a Death Eater, and felt betrayed when they found out? Were they aware that he was one, and simply didn't care? Or is the prophet right in saying that it was only ever allegations that were made against him? If he was proven innocent, considered non-threatening enough to have only been on house arrest all this time, that should mean something, right? Only, Harry knows from experience that this most certainly isn't the case. Ernie slams on the brakes and the night bus skids to a halt in front of a small and shabby-looking pub. In all the confusion, Harry didn't even realize how close they'd arrived to his destination. Thank you for the ride, Harry says to Ern, his voice still shaky from the revelations. He trots down the steps and helps Stan lower his trunk and Hedwig's cages onto the pavement. Bye, then, Harry gives a small wave, but Stan isn't paying attention. Still standing in the doorway to the bus, he instead goggles at the shadowy entrance to the leaky cauldron. There you are, Harry, says a voice. Before Harry can turn, he feels a hand on his shoulder. Blimey. Ern. Come, air. Come, air. Harry looks up at the owner of the hand on his shoulder and feels a bucketful of ice cascade into his stomach. He has walked right into Cornelius Fudge, the Minister of Magic himself. Stan leaps onto the pavement beside them. What did you call Neville, Minister? He says excitedly. And Harry is panicking so badly because on top of having blown his aunt up tonight and found out that his parents used to be friends with a potential Death Eater, he has now come face to face with the head of all authorities, and his expulsion from Hogwarts is looking more and more inevitable by the second. Bye, Neville. Stan eventually calls, and then Fudge is marching Harry along the narrow passage after Tom the bartender's lantern, and then into a small parlor. Tom clicks his fingers, a fire bursts into life in the grate, and he bows himself out of the room. Fudge introduces himself. Harry is not so stupid as to tell him he already knew who Fudge was, because that would sound rude, and the last thing he needs when he's broken a wizarding law is to be rude to the Minister of Bloody Magic. What? Oh, yes, Fudge says, when Harry hesitantly brings up the matter of Aunt Marge. Yes, DMLE representatives will be here shortly to judge if you were in a life-threatening situation, enough to excuse your use of illegal magic. Harry's stomach sinks, as this was most certainly not the case. But that is not why I am here. I've come, Mr. Potter, in concern for your safety. Rumors circulating through the legal departments, it wouldn't look good. It wouldn't look good at all, you see, if someone so obviously acknowledged to be one of them. Minister. Harry flinches at the coldness of the voice, but Fudge actually jumps in his seat. Harry looks up to see the man on the front page towering over their booth. Sirius Black, in the flesh. Lord Black. Fudge exclaims. I did not, that is to say, we were not to think how did, I would advise you to hold your tongue, Minister, if all that comes from your mouth will either incoherent sounds or decades-old accusations against those who have already been deemed innocent. Of course, Fudge babbles away. Young Neville and I, we were only just, the minister shrinks into himself, his feeble attempts at lies being reduced to nothing at Black's stern gaze. Black is somewhat like Lucius Malfoy, Harry thinks, in the way that he can make the minister so afraid, and yet, something tells him that Lucius Malfoy would not be able to command authority with a single stare and a non-threatening one, at that as Black clearly can. Go on, Minister, Black says coolly. Do enlighten me as to what business the Minister for Magic has with a schoolboy. Fudge swallows. He broke the decree for the restriction of underage wizardry. And it is the minister's job to personally handle these matters, is it? Black says dryly, and there's a small sense of humor there, but Harry's too frightened of everything at the moment to be sure. Leave, Cornelius. I wish to speak with my godson in private. What? Harry blurts out without thinking, then immediately slaps a hand to his mouth. Fudge seems to realize whatever he was hoping to chat about with Harry isn't worth having to deal with Black's ire, because he hastily relinquishes his seat to Black and scrambles off. And Harry is realizing he has something to thank for the Dursleys after all, as he is trying his best to make no noise and pretend he doesn't exist, because what kind of terrifying man must Black be to send the minister running? How powerful must he be, to have slaughtered 13 people in broad view and gotten away with it? On the run from the law at 13, Black smiles softly. Your father would have been so proud. Black calls for Tom and asks for the most expensive drink they have, pleasantly ignoring Harry's gaping mouth until the fire whiskey has been summoned up at once and poured into a glass. Sirius Black, Lord to the noble and most ancient, Black stops abruptly, likely when he notices that Harry has blinked several dozen times in the span of these few words. Sirius Black. Your father's closest friend when he was alive, and your godfather. Harry knows he should say something witty or at least polite right now, because clearly earning Black's favor will score points for him in the way of not getting expelled, but all he can do is gawk before croaking out, I didn't know I had a godfather, sir. Black's expression turns chilly at once, and Harry has to suppress a flinch. You wouldn't have, Black agrees. James and Lily's wills were sealed, so it was only natural that your closest blood relatives were given custody of you. It was only very recently that I was able to make any legal moves at all. Black thins his lips in what is well-controlled rage, but rage nonetheless. I expected to find you in the care of one of your parents' former friends. Or an occasional acquaintance from the old crowd, perhaps. To think that instead, you were being raised with that filthy muggle your mother had to call a sister. Harry makes a very, very stupid decision just then. One has to wonder how he has survived this long with such horrifically terrible survival instincts, but he just can't help himself. That sneer, that derision which Black used to describe Aunt Petunia, not that Harry thinks she doesn't deserve it, but the way it sounded a lot like Malfoy in the way that it seemed to be grouping all muggles into the same category. Harry leaps forward and shoves Black's left sleeve up to his elbows. The faint outline of the dark mark, which Harry can vaguely recall hearing from the private meeting McGonagall invited him to last year, ripples gently on Black's pale flesh. Harry holds his breath. Black has gone rigid, silent, so frighteningly still like a statue that were any other customers else around at this time of night, they would instantly notice the shift in the air, too. Black stands up abruptly, and Harry scrambles back, because he has that look in his eye that Uncle Vernon got last year, eyes bloodshot like a madman before he drilled bars onto Harry's windows. Black barks for Tom to give them a room upstairs, shoving his sleeve down before the bartender returns with the keys. Harry finds himself jumping to his feet and walking, in whichever direction Black wants him to go, not because he's being influenced by magic in any way, but because he knows from experience that the consequences always are worse with more seconds that are spent lingering. Harry is climbing up the stairs, his feet moving quickly, with Black right at his back. He stays calm, or at least tries to stay calm, with the knowledge that not even Black would dare do anything too terrible in such a public establishment. Only, no, if Black got away with killing a street full of muggles, he probably assumes he can get away with killing Harry, too. And then Harry's mind backtracks again, reminding him that he's the bloody boy who lived, and if he's had to live with that nonsense title for 2 whole years, it might as well do him some good now and protect him from this no longer alleged Death Eater, because not even Sirius Black can get away with killing the boy who lived, right? Of course, harming him is another matter, and if the Dursleys have managed to get away with it for years, Harry imagines it won't be too difficult for Black to get in a few good beatings, or maybe curses, as his ridiculously expensive-looking traditional wizard's robes seem to indicate that he prefers doing things the magical way. The important thing here is that Harry won't be sustaining any permanent injuries tonight, and hasn't that always been the only priority in everyone's minds? Despite his self-assurances, Harry jumps back when Black shuts the door behind him, and takes shelter by pressing himself against the furthest wall. Black is still fuming, looking almost animalistic with his anger as he snarls out, "Whatever lies that old fool Dumbledore told you about me." He didn't. He's never mentioned you, sir, not once. I only just found out about you an hour ago," Harry exclaims, willing to get hurt himself but refusing to let Dumbledore get dragged into this. Black considers him for a moment. Then, quick as a flash, he has composed himself. He approaches Harry slowly, appearing to have noticed his apprehensive state, then reaches into his robes to offer Harry a sheet of parchment, rolled up in ribbon and a broken wax seal. The last will and testament of James F. Potter I, James Fleemont Potter, of sound mind and magic, hereby declare Harry James Potter to be my heir in blood and fortune. In the case of my death, should my heir not have yet reached his magical majority, it is my will that my magically bonded, Lily J. Potter, takes custody of his person and his inheritance until he comes of age. In the case of her death, should the same circumstances apply, it is my will that my heir becomes ward to his appointed guardians, Sirius O. Black and Alice M. Longbottom. Why? Do you have that on your arm, sir? Harry asks carefully. I worked for Dumbledore as a spy in Voldemort's army. Harry hesitates again, but he has to get answers. Then why would you speak badly of him? Black's face hardens into something unforgiving. In the months leading up to James and Lily's deaths, I had to grow increasingly vigilant in the Dark Lord's inner circle. He grew paranoid with each passing day, and I was made to prove my loyalties to him by displaying my masteries over the dark arts and sharing its secrets with his soldiers. Dumbledore took one look at the dark magic wafting off of me and decided that I had turned on him. And then, he growls, and Harry can swear Black's voice drops an octave, he failed them. All those promises, and for what? Your parents died, with assurances of Dumbledore's protection still echoing in their heads. He could have easily spared us all by confronting Voldemort himself, but he instead decided to put stock in a fucking. Black shuts his eyes. When he opens his mouth again, his voice comes out much calmer than before. Your parents trusted me enough to be your guardian. I am not a good man, but I can swear to you that I mean you no harm. You will accompany me to the ministry in dealing with the custody procedures, and you will leave those muggles behind and become my ward. Black isn't, he's not lying, exactly. There's definitely something he's hiding here, but... An owl shoots into the room through the narrow window. A howler unfolds itself in midair and begins to speak. Dear Mr. Potter, we have received intelligence that you performed the inflation charm at 33 minutes past 7 this evening in a Muggle-inhabited area. And in the presence of Muggles. The severity of this breach of the decree for the reasonable restriction of underage sorcery has resulted in the counseling of expulsion from Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. As you have already received an official warning for a previous offense under Section 13 of the International Confederation of Warlocks Statute of Secrecy, we regret to inform you that your presence is required at a disciplinary hearing at the Ministry of Magic at 10 a.m. on the 13th of August. Yours sincerely, Mafalda Hopkirk. You will not be expelled, and I will see to it that this does not remain a stain on your record, either. Okay, Harry squeaks. He'll take whatever he's offered at this point, he can't lose. Hogwarts, his only home, but the fact that Black clearly had James Potter's approval does mean something to Harry. Maybe he should feel bad that the word of a father he can't remember means more to him than Dumbledore's thoughts of Black, but the fact of the matter is, Black offered to get him away from the Dursleys, for good, and it's the best thing that anyone has ever done for Harry. And yes, he technically demanded it rather than offered it, but Harry has long since learned to expect little from parental figures, and to discover one that is helpful as well as kind would be enough of a shock to send him over the edge. Fudge wishes to keep me from taking legal custody of you. It would not look good if the boy who lived were to become the ward of a known Death Eater, no matter how clean my official records might be. All of magical Britain is aware of the mark on my arm, and unlike Lucius Malfoy, I have not been so fortunate to escape the public's ire. You will remain here tonight, so as to not give the ministry an excuse to deny us my guardianship over you. Okay. Harry repeats his answer from before. I thank you. Black nods once, then moves to depart. Wait. Harry calls out. Black pauses, and Harry hesitates. What did you mean, sir, before? When you said my father would have been proud of me nearly getting chucked into Azkaban. A rare smile slits across Black's lips. Harry gets the oddest sense that this is an entirely different Sirius Black that he's seeing right now, someone friendly and carefree, less intimidating and powerful, but much more fun to be around. James had to reach 15 before he ever got in trouble with the law, Black replies. He and I stole a Muggle motorbike and broke about 24 traffic laws while speeding through London in it. It was the best birthday night of my life. Harry can't help but smile a little, too. Black's eyes get all wistful as he shares this short tale, and Harry knows for certain right then that his father meant a lot to Black. Oh, and Harry? Black pauses for the second time, turning again before he leaves. Stop calling me sir. James would be rolling over in his grave if he heard. Yes, sir. I mean, Black smirks a bit, and there it is again, that different serious Black, shining through carefully. That night, Harry goes to sleep not happy, but content, for the first time in a very long while. Chapter end notes. So I'm gonna be going for keeping Sirius dark, as in ruthless but not evil, and keeping him a purist, but not in the Lucius Malfoy sense of the word, but more like I hate Dumbledore he got James killed sense of the term. Also, not pot's gonna be a thing 'cause they're my babies and I love 'em. Half lies and half truths. Chapter notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Lord Black, if you would tell us why you chose to take custody of Mr. Potter, how does it feel to know you will be living with the man who betrayed your parents? Has anyone checked for the Imperius? Does Potter know what he's agreed to? My parents trusted him, Harry firmly repeats to himself. My parents trusted him, and that's good enough for me. Mr. Potter, are you aware that there were rumors your godfather was the secret keeper too? No one could have betrayed them but him, filthy Death Eater. Harry, my boy. Harry's head snaps up at that. It couldn't be, but yes, there he is, Albus Dumbledore. Cutting his way across the Ministry atrium as the crowd parts for him like the sea. Harry has never seen Dumbledore so full of fire as he is now, and suddenly, Harry realizes that, if Black hadn't used his ominously powerful influence to get the Department of Family Relations and Child Welfare started up at an absurdly early time this morning, Professor Dumbledore would surely have made it very, very difficult for the request for guardianship to go through. Ah, I see you have met your godfather, Dumbledore says, his eyes twinkling. Guards. Black barks, and the poor Ministry guards are torn between having to deal with a fuming Lord Black and attempting to restrain Albus Dumbledore himself. Scowling, Black glares at Dumbledore and says, Harry is now my ward, Albus, as he always should have been. This matter is far outside your jurisdiction as headmaster of my ward's school. As headmaster, yes, but as chief warlock of the Wizengamot. You still have no rights to this, so stop acting like you don't know that and leave. That is my only warning. Harry has seen the headmaster treat people with kindness, with indifference, with patronizing smiles and suspicious gazes. But as of right now, Dumbledore leaves no trace of doubt in anyone's mind that Sirius is to be regarded as an enemy when he says with deadly softness, you relinquished any right to Harry when you turned on us, Sirius. Harry belongs with his family, as you belong with yours. Black, somehow unfazed, sneers out, what do you imagine I'll do with him, Dumbledore? Kill him for vengeance upon the Dark Lord's death? Poison his mind with purist ideals? Open his eyes to ancient curses and the darkest of magics? I know you have Harry's best interests at heart. That, I do not doubt, Dumbledore replies. But you will forgive me, Lord Black, if I refuse to allow Harry Potter to become the ward of a former Death Eater. Accusing me of the same crimes with no proof, just as you did back then? Deny it, then, Dumbledore says. In Harry's presence, deny to me and him that you were ever on Voldemort's side. And Harry waits for him to do just that. Black's explanation sounded perfectly reasonable the previous night. As much as Harry trusts and respects Dumbledore, he knows the headmaster can get quite stubborn when it comes to the line between light and dark. Personally, Harry finds the classification a nuisance, because magic is magic, and it's up to the wielder to decide whether they'll be good or bad. Magic doesn't have morals. But when it comes to Dumbledore, Harry can easily see the headmaster deciding to cast Black away, refusing to acknowledge his contributions to the Order's cause, just because he dabbled a bit in the dark arts. Harry frowns. Sir Lord Black? Black isn't saying anything. He simply glares at Dumbledore with all the malignance in the world. He isn't denying that he was on Voldemort's side, and that's when Harry gets the sinking sensation that he has just made a terrible mistake. Black's hand clamps down on Harry's shoulder. He disapparates them out of the Ministry atrium where apparition without approval is not allowed, leaving the blaring of a dozen caterwauling charms in their wake. Get away from me, Death Eater, Harry screams, thrashing and scrambling away from Black. All the nervous apprehension he was having around Black this morning is gone. entirely and replaced with defiance. Harry always was better at facing down the more imminent threats than the lesser ones, after all. Unable to move to save his skin when Dudley and his gang found him, yet Harry had no trouble at all burning Voldemort's face-off down in the third-floor corridor. Harry gets free and waves his wand wildly, only miserably realize that he knows no good offensive or defensive spells. The threats he's encountered in the past: cursed brooms, dark lords beneath turbans, cursed bludgers, and giant man-eating serpents, all of them he lived through without the actual use of spells. Anything he could come up with are a couple of pranking charms, and Harry would rather take his chances with his fists than give Black the satisfaction of laughing at him before God knows what. Impedimenta, Black sighs, barely breathing out the words. Merlin. How could Harry have been so stupid? Accepting help from a known Death Eater, just because he was shown a slip of paper? For all he knows, the will could have been a fake. Of course, there was a goblin seal on that scroll, and Hermione did tell him goblin seals are notoriously impossible to replicate, but still, Harry should have consulted with Dumbledore, at least. Harry struggles against the spell. It's a simple one. He knows the 5th years at Hogwarts learn it, at least, nothing too complicated, and for one wild moment, Harry actually breaks free. More because Black is taken by surprise than anything else. Harry manages 3 whole steps towards the fireplace of wherever it is they are. A huge crash sounds from a neighboring room. Both Harry and Black snap their heads around to the source of the sound at once. The atmosphere suddenly becomes a whole lot more dangerous, and when Black raises a finger to his lips, Harry obeys and stays silent. Sirius. It's a boy, Harry's age, stumbling around and crashing into walls with his hands stretched out ahead of him. Swearing, Black rushes forward, Harry forgotten, and hurries to support the boy before he can fall. Before Harry can even think about escaping, the boy is being shoved into his arms. Black is telling Harry something, telling him to hide in the nearest room and to stay silent. He'll handle this. Harry has just shut the door behind himself and the boy in his arms, when another resounding crash is heard, but this one sounds a lot more deliberate than the one the boy made. Harry glances down at him, the fellow 13-year-old who's taken refuge in a corner of the small kitchen they're in. His knees are to his chest, his hands around his legs, and when he looks up, breath's panicking, Harry stumbles back and hides a gasp. The boy's pupils are so pale they've lost all their color. Now the stumbling around makes a lot more sense. Harry can only hope that the boy was born blind and not made blind by whatever disturbing curses that Black gets up to experimenting with in his spare time. Where is he? Comes a new voice, causing the boy to flinch violently. If you are hiding my son from me, Black, I swear to all the gods, you are trespassing in the home of my ancestors, Thaddeus. Listen to me when I say their spirits won't take kindly to that, let alone threatening the Lord Black in his own home. More arguing takes place, but the voices have quieted down that Harry can't make out the words anymore. He turns his attention to the boy instead, sharp-jawed and long-limbed, and tries to get another look at his eyes. Do you want me to try fixing them for you? Harry asks, unsure where the question is coming from, not knowing with what confidence it is that has him believing this curse, if something so terrible can be summed up in one word, is reversible. But it must be. From the sound of things, this Thaddeus person, this boy's father, did this to him. And no father in the world could be cruel enough to inflict permanent blindness on their child. Not that Harry would know, but he's seen enough evidence of it to figure it out. Mr. Weasley and how kindly he treats his children, Malfoy and how he's always bragging about what new things his father has bought him, and even Dudley, with the way Uncle Vernon continuously makes up more and more outrageous excuses for his terrible behavior. Not to mention Harry's own father, who gave up his life for his 1-year-old son. Harry knows, he just knows, that if James Potter had survived that Halloween night, he would have grown to be a wonderful father as any. Who are you? The boy asks quietly. It unnerves Harry that he can't recognize this boy. Magical Britain is a small world after all, and any boy his age living here, he should have seen at least once at Hogwarts. Does the boy study abroad, then? Or is Hogwarts a big enough castle that it's reasonable to presume Harry simply never crossed paths with him before? Look, I know what I'm doing, all right? Let me help you. Harry most definitely does not know what he is doing. Well, he does, but it's more like he wouldn't be able to explain it in words if someone asked him to. He can sense it, the dark magic oozing out of the boy's eyes, and he instinctively understands that it is not that the boy's sight has been taken away, but simply covered up by this veil of darkness. So Harry weaves a bit of light magic across his fingers, and uses it to wash the darkness away. Color begins to return to the boy's eyes, as though fog is clearing. They are a beautiful shade of bluish gray, more on the warm side than Black's icy ones. For a few moments, the boy is disoriented, blinking several times as he tries to take in his surroundings, and then, "Potter!" The boy squawks, and scrambles to his feet at once. A deep scarlet flush is creeping up his neck, and Harry can easily recognize it for what it is. Shame that someone has seen him at his weakest, and the horrible sense of vulnerability that is following soon after. Harry knows this because he has experienced it himself. When he was little and hadn't learned to stand the hunger yet, so he would go digging around trash bins until he found something salvageable to eat. Then an old man caught him doing that once, and Harry never went scavenging for food again, no matter how hungry he got. Harry isn't sure if his next words will be a comfort to the boy or not, but he has to ask anyway. Do I know you?" The boy blinks. Clearly, he wasn't expecting that, and with good reason, too. Harry was probably right in suspecting that he has been sharing the same castle with this boy for 2 years. "Theodore," Black bursts into the kitchen, his wand out as he hurries toward them. "What was it? Did he blind you again? Are you all right?" "Again?" Harry shudders at the word. The Dursleys starved him and they beat him from time to time, but never blinded him, and certainly not on a regular basis that a word like "again" could be put into use. Not that he doubts the Dursleys would have done just that if they could have gotten away with it, but they couldn't and so they didn't, and that's the main difference here. "He fixed it, Theodore not," Harry recalls, jabs a finger in Harry's direction, glaring at him and acting all accusatory. This sends a spike of annoyance through Harry's nerves, of course, because how was Harry supposed to know this Slytherin idiot wanted to stay blind? "It's not that, you know it isn't," says a voice in Harry's head, one that sounds like an alarming mix of Ron and Hermione's. Harry understands, of course he does. Not as feeling vulnerable at the moment, so he's taking it all out on the person in the room he feels the least safe around. "I was only trying to help," Harry grumbles, rather than launching into a tirade about how he most certainly won't be offering his unwanted help the next time something like this happens. He expects this to be the end of that Black will busy himself with coddling Not and Harry will be able to make his escape. But then he sees the way Black is staring at him with wide, alarmed eyes, and Harry tenses up. "What?" Harry frowns, growing defensive at once. "It took me months to figure out how to undo this particular curse," Black begins. "Theo always had to wait it out for hours before then. How could you have possibly?" "I don't know," Harry scowls. "The only real difference, as far as I can tell, is that one of us doesn't have a bloody dark mark branded onto their arm. I have only your best interests at heart, Harry. I told you this." "You lied. You said you weren't really a Death Eater, that you were only a spy, so why wouldn't you answer?" "I never lied, and I never said I was not a real Death Eater," Black replies. "I told you Dumbledore branded me a traitor because I was using the dark arts. I never claimed his accusations were untrue, simply that they were unjust." "That doesn't even make any sense. At any rate, Harry, the wards of this house are millennium old. You will not be making it out of Grimmauld Place without my explicit permission, and for your sake, I suggest that you don't try. Especially considering you will still be requiring my help for your ministry hearing, and I won't be able to help much if you don't show up to the ministry with me." "Why?" Harry's voice cracks. "Why would you join him? You were best mates with my father, I saw the pictures." "I did it for him," Black snaps. "Everything I did, everything I do, it is all for him." Chapter end notes. We'll be heading into a flashback of the early 80s for the next chapter. Hope you're enjoying the FIC so far, smiley face. Justification. Chapter notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. March 1980. Sirius was not a blood purist. He did think he was above most people, but because he was a Black, not because he was a pureblood. And yes, there was the annoying little fact that all Blacks were purebloods, and so his very statement was contradictory, but there was truth to it regardless. He had never really fed into the lies about Muggleborns being lesser than purebloods, as there were living proofs disproving that entirely. Once he had started Hogwarts, Sirius had been able to see that for himself. Blood purity did not matter. But the black name did. Oh, it did very much. Sirius saw much proof of that too, in his Hogwarts years. Whether it was the way certain professors would avoid putting him in detention for very perceivable slights, or the way the Hogsmeade shopkeepers whose establishments the marauders had broken into on various dares had let them go with a warning and a blanched face the moment Sirius had introduced himself. It was all the same. Names carried power, and none more so than that of his noble and most ancient line. So really, it wasn't purist ideals that were to blame for the manner in which his pent-up irritation for Dumbledore finally showed itself. The headmaster had been bothering him non-stop these past few days, prodding him for information on the Death Eaters that Sirius did not have, never ceasing with that Sir's forsaken speculative looks that suggested he thought Sirius was keeping things from him. Sirius had known it was too good to be true when Dumbledore had invited him, a black, into the Order with open arms, for as powerful as the black name was, it came with its fair share of injustices as well. But he digressed. "Do you smell something, Rabaston?" Sirius furrowed his brows, and turned his head up in the air. "You really should leave the windows open some more." Was that? Rabaston Lestrange spoke in a slurring voice, drunk off his ass because he was moping about it not having been chosen as a participant for the next Death Eater mission. "That smell. Gods, the stench is nauseating. The smell, Rabaston, the filth that walked through the door just now." Rabaston broke out into a fit of cackles, while the two masked half-blood Death Eaters shuffled into the room wordlessly. Sirius knew what faces rested beneath those masks. He hoped the one on the right, Jugson, was it? Didn't take the blood purity comment to heart. It wasn't him whom Sirius had been meaning to wrangle the hatred out of, after all. "Well then, let's hear it." Sirius smiled lazily at Snape through the eye-holes of his mask. "Give us the report, lads." Jugson, a weedy little thing who was perhaps a year younger than Sirius in age, started spilling out all the information he and Snape had gathered on the whereabouts and location plans of the list of prospective candidates. It was a collection of names the inner circle had put together with Sirius's help, approved first by Dumbledore, of course, all of them being possible secret keeper candidates for the Fidelius on the Potters that had not yet been cast. Apparently, the logic behind the Fidelius charm had been a topic for debate for decades, as some scholars preferred to classify the spell more as a rune than a charm, as very few other charms in the world took quite so long to prepare for. It was almost like brewing a potion in a way. Time and effort had to be put into preparing for the process in order for it to actually produce results. Because of this, the earliest that anyone would be able to cast the spell for the Potters would be in early October. We've tracked down the locations of McKinnon's family members, sir, but the place the Longbottoms are in is unplottable," Jugson began. "I know Vance isn't very high up on the list, but we still looked her up, anyway. The flat she's allegedly living in seems to be a fake for now. There aren't any signs of anyone actually living there." "Excellent work," Sirius says, jotting down a mental note to tell Marlene to relocate her family to another place. "But, oh, that won't do. I see a problem here." Jugson gave a terrified squeak and snapped to attention as straight as a rod. "You do you?" Lestrange replied gleefully in the meanwhile, fully sobered up at the promise of a show. "Well, Rabaston, it is of my humble opinion that everyone should pull their own weight, you see, in this war that we're fighting in." "I quite agree, Sirius, I quite agree. Jugson here has done his part quite nicely, but that begs the question, what has Severus brought to the table?" "Oh, actually, sir, Severus and I work together to collect the Jugson?" "Yes, sir." "Stop talking." "Yes, sir." "Let's hear it, then." Sirius clapped his hands together. "How shall Severus make use of himself for us? Any thoughts?" Lestrange grinned, catching on quickly. "Perhaps he can start by mopping up this mess." "And what mess would that be, Rabaston?" "Don't you see it, Sirius dear? The whiskey is dripping all onto the carpets." "Oh, hang on." Rabaston leaned forward and knocked his bottle of fire whiskey off the table and onto the floor. "As I was saying, the whiskey is dripping all onto the carpets. Perhaps he could start with that." Sirius didn't know why he hadn't spent more time with Rabaston before this. The man was an absolute delight to have around. I'm certain the filthy half-blood would be happy to be reminded of his place in the world. crawling around at our feet is exactly where his kind belongs. Ah, the whole purist thing. Right. Rabaston, Sirius sighed. He tried to draw the topic away from blood purity, but he possibly made things worse by saying what he did next. Look at that, you fool. You got whiskey splattered all over my shoes. Do you know how much of a headache it is to import dragon leather these days? Stop whining, Black. Here, I've changed my mind. Snape, you can polish Sirius's boots for him instead. It would be a great honor for you, I'm sure. Sirius, who hadn't been having anywhere near as much fun as he could have because the cacophony of Snape's expressions had been remaining hidden behind that mask of his, gave his wand a sharp flick and summoned Snape's mask to his hand. What was then revealed delightfully met Sirius's expectations in every way. Poor Snivellus, Sirius cooed. Snape's face had turned to an alarming shade of purple, but the idiot wouldn't even be in this place if he'd just slunk off into anonymity after graduation, instead of signing up for the Death Eaters right off the bat. Sirius had no sympathy to spare for slimy, stinking Death Eaters, and fully planned to make that clear right now. Running straight to the purists because you thought getting to destroy and kill and tear apart would make you feel strong. That punishing the weak would make you feel better about yourself. Poor Snivellus, he did all that, only to find himself right back where he started, unable to escape his past and his childhood bully, all because he never had a chance of belonging in the first place, Sirius sneered. Thought you would have learned long before now, Snape. Wherever you give life and a limb to reach, I can get there with the snap of my fingers. Because I am someone, and you are nothing. Because I am a Black, and you're a nameless half-blood rodent who really should be honored to get to grovel at my feet. Now. Come here, get on your knees, and do as Rabaston says. For a single millisecond there, Sirius genuinely felt scared for his life. That murderous glint in Snape's eyes was disturbing. That was what it always was, wasn't it? Snape whispered, ignoring both Judson and Rabaston, the former of whom looked ready to faint in fear and the latter who appeared delighted at having stumbled upon some quality entertainment. The prince of all pure bloods with his pure blood friends, coming after the penniless half-blood in their year. Careful, Snape. Sirius cocked his head to the side. You wouldn't want anyone to think you were threatening a member of the inner circle, now would you? You talk about punishing the weak when you and fucking Potter, privileged and pure-blooded and filthy rich as you both were. Keep his name out of your fucking mouth. Sirius slammed his hands onto the table and shot up to his feet. What, Potter? Snape snarled. James fucking Potter, protected by his friends in high places even now. Why do you worship him so much? The war is a joke to him. Regardless of which side wins, he's still going to be the pureblood lord of an old house. He treats the war like he does life as a source of entertainment. His life has been fucking torn apart by the bloody war. Sirius roared. His parents are dead. His friends are dead, and his own fucking wife is as good as dead thanks to you. Apparently, Snape was not very happy to hear that ugly truth. He gave a cry of pure rage, before lashing out with a bone-breaking curse, powerful enough that it would take great effort to deflect, and one which Sirius casually sidestepped as it came whizzing for him. Oh, Snape. Sirius laughed lightly, you are so fucked. Snape seemed to realize this as well, when Rabaston slowly rose to his feet. Low-ranking half-blood Snape had indeed attacked a member of the inner circle, which was literally what Sirius had warned him against, so Sirius decided that whatever was coming next was entirely justified in its happening. Fulmentio. Bolts of electric charges, lightning wielded like a weapon, sizzled straight out of Lestrange's wand and shot itself at Snape. Choosing survival over dignity, Snape hit the ground, having the lightning blast apart an antique table in his stead. Damn it. Rabaston swore. Rhodey's going to have my head, that belonged to his favorite great-aunt. The duel that followed was not very pretty. Judson proved himself the smartest of them all by diving behind the nearest couch the first chance he got. So with him out of the picture, it was 2 against 1, and Snape's attempts to even the odds by screaming that it was cowardly of Sirius and Rabaston to both attack him at the same time was reminiscent of the good old Hogwarts days. The only difference was, while this tactic had worked wonders with Gryffindor through and through James Potter, who had seen the logic in these words and had decided on the noble option of either dueling Snape himself or stepping back as Sirius gave it his all, it did not work nearly as well for the paragon of Slytherin that was Rabaston Lestrange, nor for Sirius, who had always been less on the noble and chivalrous side of Gryffindor and more on the bold and reckless side. Together, Sirius and Lestrange ruined him. Was any of this truly necessary? Rodolphus sighed as he stared upon the sight of his burnt-up sitting room. That was the last time he was letting Black anywhere near his house without proper supervision, and no, Rabaston most certainly did not count as that. "Ah, what's a little mess or two between family?" Black said, clapping Rodolphus on the back. It was only the presence of Bellatrix's tight grip on his arm that kept Rodolphus from landing a punch straight to Black's noble and most ancient front teeth. "Bella, lovely to see you as always." Black winked at Bellatrix, displaying the so-called Gryffindor boldness by acting flirtatiously in front of his cousin's own husband. No. Rodolphus did not have any doubts as to what it was that hovered between his wife and the Black heir. Fucking Blacks. Fucking Sirius Black, with his sudden declaration that he would be taking up the dark mark and his displays of absurd levels of magical prowess that had earned him a seat in the inner circle in record time. Rodolphus could admit to himself that he was envious of Black in more ways than one. The exchange of flirtatious looks with his wife aside, there was the fact that the Dark Lord seemed to have taken a personal interest in the Black heir as well. "You're a real piece of work, you know that, Black?" Rodolphus bit out. "Wouldn't be me if I wasn't, dear cousin-in-law," Sirius sang back. There was something not quite right with the man, Rodolphus decided. But whether that was just the usual Black madness manifesting or something more nefarious, he would make sure to find out. Chapter endnotes gonna be flitting back and forth between the flashbacks and present-day stuff, progressing with Notpot in the late 90s while slowly building up to what side Sirius really ended up on in the early 80s. Smiley face. Conditional chapter summary: my poor BBY Theo really does need a hug, sad face. Also, him being unreasonably grumpy at Harry is just so funny to me for some reason. I've finally decided on the perfect storyline for how it all ended in 1980, why both Potters ended up dead, why Sirius ended up the way he is now, and exactly under what circumstances it was that the small rift between Sirius and Albus grew into an all-out murderous canyon of a void laughing face. Theo hates Harry Potter. He didn't even know it was possible to feel such hatred for a person in such a short amount of time, but that is the simple truth. Within 2 weeks of being formally introduced to each other for the first time, the boy who lived has stolen Theo's whole life right out from under his nose. "Worthless," his father seethed. "You are not deserving of my name. A mudblood off the streets would make for a better heir than you." Theo was 7 years old when he met Sirius Black for the first time. "If you disgrace the house of Nott as you always do while in the presence of our guest, mark my words, Theodore, I will make you wish for death as much as I wish it of you." The fireplace flared to life. From it stepped out a man who was quite possibly the only person in the world who dressed better than Lucius Malfoy. Lord Malfoy was Draco's father, and Draco was a whiny little idiot who seemed to have a much different relationship with his father than Theo did with his own. Draco was always crying about everything, and Lord Malfoy was always panicking over Draco's tears. When Draco got hurt for the first time and Lucius Malfoy had come running, Theo had thought for sure that Draco would get slapped, or screamed at the very least, for his displays of pain and vulnerability. Instead, Lord Malfoy had nearly broken down into tears himself at the sight of Draco's scraped knee, and had then proceeded to give Draco what Theo would later learn was called a hug. Theo had been unsettled by the Malfoys ever since. The closeness of it all disturbed him, and more than that, it frightened him. He was not entirely sure why. In any case, the man currently dusting the flow powder off his expensive robes was clearly in no way anything like Lord Malfoy, for while he had obviously caught the end of Father's words, his expression remained unchanged. As though it was perfectly acceptable that Theo should be spoken to this way. Theo knew that it was acceptable. He knew that he was deserving of Father's hatred, because he was a worthless and incapable heir whose life should never have been saved in exchange for Alethea Nott's. It comforted him, in a way, to have confirmation that all in his life was as it should be, that it was the Malfoys that were the odd ones out, not them. "Black, it has been too long. Nowhere near as long as I would have wished it to be, Nott," the man muttered. "But these are matters that must be addressed." "As charming as ever, I see," Father replied. "I must say, I'm surprised they've let you out of the house. The Ministry adores keeping you on a tight leash, don't they? What the Aurors won't know won't hurt them. They can place boundary spells on Grimmauld Place all they like, But they forget that the old houses are all connected in one way or another. Besides, their charms are faulty, as if anything could override the centuries' worth of magic that has been fed into my ancestral home. Black blood confuses them, then, father guessed. So long as a black remains inside the house, but of course, Dowager Black still lives on. And Circe knows the ministry would do anything to avoid a confrontation with her. To the dining room, then. Dinner first, and then we'll talk. Theo trailed after them, silent and invisible, just as he'd taught himself to be. Father sat at the head of the table, Lord Black at his right, and Theo took his seat one chair down from Father's left, keeping the seat once meant for Alethea empty. Basilisk venom, you say? I have shared with you my many contacts over the years, Thaddeus. I would hope you would return the favor by offering me the same. And it has to be basilisk. Cockatrice blood acts as a suitable replacement in certain potions, when paired with boomslang venom. No, it has to be a basilisk. Didn't you once say something about knowing a wizard in Ethiopia who specializes in exotic breeding? I did, didn't I? Though whether he breeds basilisks specifically, I think I'll go check right now. Help yourself to the first course, Black, I'll be back soon. Theo tracked Father with his eyes when he left the room, yet still he flinched with the loud shutting of the door. With the stranger beside him, his actions became especially pronounced, and his hand went knocking into the stem of his glass. Theo's heart stopped beating for a prolonged moment. Though he managed to catch the glass before it hit the ground, his shirt was now entirely drenched in water. I will make you wish for death as much as I wish it of you. Theo couldn't help it. He began to cry, and immediately, he clapped a hand to his mouth to keep the sobs in, because crying would make this so much worse. Proper heirs, worthy heirs whose first actions in the world did not comprise of killing their own mothers, did not display weakness. But Theo didn't want to be made to wish for death, though already he was feeling it now anyway, that he would rather be dead than have to face his father, rather be dead like Alethea, because maybe then, Father would finally love him half as much as he did his lost wife. Even through the tears, Theo remained observant, and he nearly shrieked when Lord Black drew his wand on him. Lord Black murmured something under his breath, an incantation. Theo shut his eyes and waited for the pain to come, but only a light breeze tickled him as it passed him by, and his shirt was dry again, completely stainless. Our secret, Lord Black mouthed to Theo and gave him a small wink. Yet by the time Father had returned, Lord Black's face had morphed back into the cool stoicism from before. So much so that Theo spent the rest of dinner wondering if he'd imagined the whole thing. He hadn't, though. In the years that would follow, Lord Black would always find some way to offer Theo some mild level of comfort whenever he was around. Never enough to catch Father's eye and risk the relationship he had with him, but just enough to have Theo looking forward to his visits. Kind words, delivered in tones Theo had never received before. Discreet healing charms at the flicks of his wand, giving him permission to flow over to Grimmauld Place whenever he wanted to after a particularly brutal night on Theo's 10th birthday. Alethea's death day, and that was what sealed the slow deal in Lord Black becoming serious to him. But Harry fucking Potter just had to come along and ruin absolutely everything. Harry, please, if you would just let me. Nope. You've been picking out books on politics, I've noticed. I could get you a tutor if, nope. You like flying, don't you, Harry? Just like your father? There's the new firebolt that, nope. I could tell you all the stories you'd like about your parents. Potter hesitates. Then, seeming to realize this, he puts on a scowl and says decisively, no. Enough is enough, really. Theo can see the famous black temper that he's only ever witnessed once in person before threatening to flood out of Sirius. Theo tries to urge it forward with his mind, begging the madness to just take over, but no. Sirius deflates like a balloon, all misery and no anger, which just seems to piss Potter off even more. I'll be in my study if either of you need me, Sirius says glumly, then trudges out of the library. Theo glares at Potter with all his might. The idiot doesn't know half of what he's saying no to. How dare he rebuff Sirius like that, when Sirius is clearly willing to do anything for his attention, which is a privilege Theo has never been able to afford. And how dare Potter pretend he can't see that Theo is obviously glowering at him with all the fury in the world. Or no, never mind. He isn't pretending. Theo is just that invisible to him, the same as he was 2 weeks ago. That's annoying, too. Did you need something, not? Potter finally glances at Theo over the edge of his Wizengamot book. You think you're so much better than us, don't you? Theo snarls. Being the boy who lived automatically grants you higher moral ground than us poor sods, is that it? Proud of being a half-blood and not a slimy, hissing, pureblood snake, are you? Just because you happen to be the son of a pureblood and a filthy fucking mudblood. Or rather, Theo imagines that he says all this, because he would rather not risk having Sirius choose his godson over him when things come down to it. Thank you very much. It has taken Sirius a very long time to convince Theo its possible love might not always be conditional in some cases. But for some reason, Theo doubts that rule would remain even when Sirius's precious James Potter's precious baby boy in all his perfect glory goes complaining to Sirius about Theo. Sirius is all that Theo has. He will swallow his pride and his anger if it means getting to keep that for longer. No, nothing, Theo replies, then goes back to finishing the final draft of his History of Magic summer homework. Living with a Death Eater isn't quite turning out to be the horrifying experience that Harry expected it to be. It's actually a whole lot worse. After finding out the hard way that Grimmauld Place indeed had wards that refused to bend to the will of anyone but its rightful lord, Harry spent the whole week holed up in the room Black had gifted to him. During the first few days, he was too pissed off and too scared to be much concerned about the ministry hearing, but the threat of losing Hogwarts won out in the end. Harry decided to accept Black's help, because really, that was the least the man could do after having literally kidnapped him right out from beneath Albus Dumbledore's nose. The hearing took place in a small courtroom in the ministry, which Harry hadn't even known existed. In fact, he found out that day that there was a whole other side to the wizarding world that he'd known nothing about. Once that realization set in, Harry felt quite overwhelmed. He hadn't really given much thought to life in the magical world outside of Hogwarts, and stupidly so. If Black hadn't been there to help, Harry would likely have said something wrong and ended up with a lot more than just expulsion at the end of the day. Thankfully, the witch and the two wizards heading the proceedings seemed too scared of Black to get a single word out, and Sirius and Black were ushered right out of the courtroom within 10 minutes of being there, with the fervent assurances that none of this would end up on Harry's legal record. So, yes, maybe there were a couple of good aspects of having a Death Eater for a godfather, but Harry doesn't care about that now that the hearing was done with. Death Eaters are evil. It's a general and irrefutable fact. So Harry keeps waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Black to stop offering him everything from pet crups to professional broomsticks to photographs of his parents, and for him to show his real self that Harry knows is hiding beneath the surface. There's a brief moment in the library, when Harry is sure that this is it. That's the look that Vernon gets every time right before he blows a fuse, but then Black's anger dissipates, and he just looks sad, like a kicked puppy. Which aggravates Harry to no end, because what game is the man playing here? Is this psychological warfare? Trying to guilt-trip Harry into doing what? What does Black want from him, anyway? Did you need something, not? Harry frowns at the boy who is a frequent visitor of Grimmauld Place for reasons Harry cannot be bothered to know. Not glares at Harry for an extra 7 whole seconds before replying with a dramatic, no, nothing. So Harry shrugs, and goes back to reading his books. The Black Library is a thing of Hermione's dreams, as big as the Hogwarts library and twice as richer in its contents. Books that even Harry knows are incredibly rare collect dust on multiple shelves. Harry hasn't tried to go anywhere near those, knowing there are usually curses and charms in place to prevent unsuspecting individuals from happening on them. Ever since he got back from the court hearing, he's busied himself with reading up on the structures of the wizarding government instead. It's really all basic information he should have learned about years ago, which does beg the question why that never came to be. Maybe it's another Muggle-born, Muggle-raised prejudice thing, in which the necessity of teaching the kids from the Muggle world basic facts is overlooked. What are your thoughts on Muggle-borns? Harry asks Black over dinner that evening. Which marks the first time that he's ever voluntarily sought out a conversation with the man since the encounter with Dumbledore led to Black alluding to the true role he played in the war. Harry doesn't miss the way Black chooses that particular moment to take a long sip from his wineglass. Right before the pause can become too prolonged that Harry can be justified in getting pissed at Black all over again, the man speaks at last. I'm not a blood purist, if that's what you're asking. James was my best friend and I supported him in every way. All right. Sure. Harry nods. So you were friends with my mother too, then? Lily and I were acquainted with each other. We had an amicable relationship, but not friends? We disagreed on too many things for that particular term to be put into use, but I respected her, her courage, her prowess. And I never stopped being grateful to her for making James happy even through the war. That thaws Harry's heart far too much for his liking, so he quickly puts on a scowl and demands, "Name one Muggle-born friend you did have, then." Black opens his mouth. And silence. Seconds tick by, and Black seems to be struggling with something. Harry, you have to understand that, it's not about prejudice, it's about cultural differences. It goes both ways. Neither Muggleborns nor purebloods can ever really be comfortable around each other. Enough to. One of my best friends is a pureblood and the other is a Muggleborn. I've never seen any two people get along anywhere near as fiercely as they do. Black takes another long sip from his glass. Fine. Whatever. A half-blood, then. You must have had at least one friend who wasn't a pureblood. I did. Of course I did. There was. Black cuts himself off abruptly, shuts his eyes, then sighs. Are you serious? Harry shouts angrily, pauses because he's realized what he's said, mostly because the upper corner of Black's mouth gives an involuntary twitch. Whatever. This is ridiculous. You didn't bother to make one single non-pureblood friend at Hogwarts? I did have a half-blood friend, a very close one, who later accused me of being a Death Eater long before Dumbledore ever asked me to start spying for him. Black's voice rises dangerously at the end there, but like always, he pressures himself to keep from directing his anger at Harry. So you did something to lose their trust badly enough to such an extent, Harry guesses. I didn't, Black swears under his breath, which is a first. Here Harry was thinking all pureblood lords were elegant and proper. I'm not a blood purist, Black repeats. I'm not. Now, Harry is starting to get a bit nervous, because it sounds less like Black is trying to get the message through to Harry, and more like he's trying to convince himself of it. And the general consensus regarding people who mutter things to themselves is, well, it's not good. I don't believe purebloods are better than Muggleborns in any way. And you think that's all that makes a blood purist, do you? Harry crosses his arms. He's pushing it, he knows this, which would be a cause for concern if he hadn't been trying to reach Black's limit ever since he was cleared to return to Hogwarts. Harry much prefers the known over the unknown, no matter how terrible the known is. Better to be around predictable Vernon and his fists and Petunia and her screeching than living with a seemingly generous and well-meaning friend of his father's who hasn't once let Harry see what would happen if his temper were to burst. Black, to his credit, appears confused by Harry's question. Let me elaborate. Do you, or do you not, think purebloods are deserving of more than Muggleborns? Of course we are, Black replies so automatically and so cluelessly that Harry is left hanging there for a moment. He really didn't think Black would admit it outright. Are you hearing yourself? Harry squeaks in disbelief. We're entitled to more because it's our ancestors that built our society from the ground up. We deserve to have our traditions respected, to have our opinions heard, more so than the ones who are only now finding out about our existence. I fully support and acknowledge Muggleborns' rights to vote and to hold office, so long as our rights to inherited seats on the Wizengamot and old alliances between the highest-ranking members of society remain upheld. Harry can't really get mad at Black, not when he's saying all this shit with such an innocent, almost childish sense of righteousness. It's not that he's evil, it's that he doesn't know that he's wrong. He doesn't understand that it's that sort of thinking that made it so easy for Voldemort to gain support when he did. Which is a bit ridiculous, really, because if 13-year-old Harry can manage it, the Lord to what Harry has recently learned is the oldest and most powerful noble house in all of magical Britain should be able to manage it, too. Just answer this for me, Harry sighs. That Halloween night, if I hadn't done whatever it was that I did, if Voldemort had succeeded in killing me, he hesitates. The world that came after, once the war had been lost, would you have been content to live in it? No, Black replies immediately. I would never have been able to live with myself. His voice shakes, but Black is unflinching as he says this. Harry nods. It's not much, but it's a start. I think I'd like to hear some of those stories about my parents now, he says quietly, and Black answers him with a warm smile. Power in a Name chapter notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Late March, 1980. To be a Black was to be feared. People cowered at the might of their power, and that was just the way they liked it. Blacks did not care for trivial human ties, nor the camaraderie that existed between certain people. For to be a Black was to never really be alone. They had each other, through the good and the bad, no matter how many wounds they tore open in each other and screamed that they wished for each other to die. Family was family at the end of the day, and none in the world protected so fiercely as the Blacks did their own. It did not matter if new names were taken on through marriage, the same as it did matter when an outsider took on their name. Daughters of House Black remained forever so, and the wives that married in forever remained separated from the true family, despite the change in their names. It was why Bellatrix and Narcissa still had access to the Black Vaults, even though a pureblood wife retaining such official ties to their birth family was generally seen as a sign of disloyalty to the family she'd married into. It was why Cernus, cruel Uncle Cygnus, while loathing his lack of sons, had only ever taken out his anger on Druella and never his 3 daughters. To be born a Black was to be born royalty, and a slight made against their own was a declaration of war against the entire family. Sirius hadn't known he'd been missing it until he came back, to be at the center of it again, amidst the stifling protectiveness and the crushing sort of obsessive care that existed between his blood family. There was a reason House Black continued to remain at the top of the hierarchy by such a wide margin. The allegiance they had to one another, the incomparable unity that flowed between their many numbers. The Blacks were nothing without them, but with them, they were unstoppable. I, Orion Arcturus Black, of sound mind and magic, hereby declare Sirius Orion Black to be my heir in blood and fortune. Upon my death, it is my will that my blood heir inherits the title of Lord to the noble and most ancient House of Black, as well as the properties, government seats, heirlooms, artifacts, and monetary inheritances that come with its position. There were several more paragraphs following that bit, including the matter of certain vaults left behind to Walburga and Regulus, and an extra dramatically phrased portion stressing the importance of preserving the family line and ensuring the Black name carried through to the next generation. Only a year ago, Sirius would have laughed it all off as arrogant pureblood pigheadedness and wasted what small pittance was thrown at him on drinks at the Leaky Cauldron. Sirius did not laugh now. He accepted the lordship ring from the head goblin lawjock, and enacted the blood ritual with nearly all living members of the House of Black present. Once back in Grimmauld Place, he allowed himself to be drawn into the heart of his ancestral home, and cast the binding magic on the founding runes that had been carved up. Over a millennium ago, he fed his magic to the house, and in return, his ancestors offered some of their own magic to him. It was glorious. Sirius couldn't believe he'd almost let this opportunity pass him by. Had Dumbledore never convinced him to return, the magic of the Blacks would have passed on to no one, and its powers would have been diluted further and further until the day Sirius died and the mantle of Lord was passed on to the next Black heir. Such a tremendous waste of magic, and for what? Out of a stubborn refusal to see potential where there was power. Differences in purist opinions aside, it would have been really stupid of Sirius to have let this opportunity pass him by. I hate you, Regulus informed him, as Creature put the finishing touches on his delightfully frilly dress robes. Words cannot express how badly I want to throttle you right now. Love you too, baby brother, Sirius grinned. Let's get going, then. Mother won't stand for being kept waiting for long. You owe me, Regulus seethed as Narcissa came to lead him away. You owe me, Sirius, I swear to all the gods. An Ostara ball, celebrating the spring equinox, serving as the perfect excuse for Walburga Black to go daughter-in-law hunting for her youngest son. Now that he'd officially taken on the title of Lord Black, Sirius had known it would only be a matter of time before Mother started looking to pressure him into finding a wife, and so, Sirius had ever so subtly nudged her in Regulus's direction before she could ever arrive at that particular conclusion. Edwina Selwyn, daughter of House Selwyn's French branch. Mother, she's 15. Give it a year and a month, she'll be of age by then. No, then how about Miss Azalea Parkinson over here? I'd rather keep my hearing intact than suffer her harpy screeching, thank you. Regina Rowell, old family friend of ours. Mother. And that needed no further explanation, as it was very clear to anyone with eyes that Regina Rowell most certainly was an old, practically ancient family friend. I don't know what you expect of me, Regulus. So ungrateful, just like your brother. Mother scowled, but there was far less menace in her words than there had been when she was spitting them out years ago. Fine, Her expression softened. Go mingle, then. See if I care if you make a fool of yourself. I hate you, Regulus repeated to Sirius as soon as she turned away. I'll pay you back, I swear it, Sirius promised. It was not a payment Regulus would end up living for long enough to collect. It was always bad enough being the boy who lived in crowded places such as Platform 9. 3/4. But to be the boy who lived in crowded places such as Platform 9 and 3/4 while also having the alleged Death Eater Lord to the noble and most ancient House of Black at his back? Harry wouldn't be surprised if someone grew a third eye just so they could gawk at him some more. Black, for the most part, seems unbothered by this. He was never bothered by the articles in the Prophet either, the ones that came all through the summer spouting speculations about his murky past and the double motives behind the claim he had staked on Harry Potter. It was like he was simply used to the attention because he'd had it all his life, which was a very foreign concept to Harry indeed, because he'd been dealing with this fame thing for a while now, too, and he hadn't been aware that it was something one could ever get used to at all. From his pocket, Harry pulls out his invisibility cloak, the very one Black noticed Harry packing this morning and spent a good 5 minutes just staring at. After that, the man had cleared his throat, looked away, and told Harry in a rather hoarse voice that he was glad it had ended up in Harry's hands. James would have wanted Harry to have it, he said, so Harry replied by saying it had helped him and his friends out a lot over the years. Black laughed at that, a friendly little laugh that gave Harry a glimpse of that other, far more likable Sirius Black he'd gotten to see the night of their first meeting. So Harry kept talking, explaining about the time he'd once used it to get into the restricted section of the library, only to nearly get caught by Filch when the books started screaming. It came as a Christmas gift, Harry said, unable to keep himself from returning Black's smile with his own. Dumbledore gave it to me. And that was how Harry found out the last thing one should ever do in front of Lord Black was mention the headmaster's name. There you are, Harry, Ron exclaims, when Harry pops up behind him inside the train, the lower half of his body still invisible. You've got a lot of explaining to do. Ron continues on, either not noticing or not surprised by the sight of Harry's upper body just floating in midair. Mum really thought you'd ended up dead or something for a while there, then you finally thought to reply to our letters. Hermione is really mad about that, by the way. Not here, Harry cuts Ron off, somewhere private. So Ron leads Harry into the almost empty compartment that he and Hermione have taken for themselves. Almost empty, because there is a grown man sleeping in there, wearing shabby robes and worn-out shoes and looking like he's just been dead for a really long time. Hermione, hi, Harry smiles, then grimaces, when Hermione greets him with a scowl. Sorry for the lack of letters? Hermione's scowl melts away into a mix of exasperation and panic at that. Harry, you idiot. I had to find out your new living conditions from the Prophet of all things. You had us worried sick about you. Are you all right? Are you hurt? I can't believe that Death Eater refused to let you meet up with us. Well, actually, what? Harry blinks, interrupting Ron again. Hermione, you do know that's not how it happened, don't you? What are you talking about? Mrs. Weasley said. Ron clears his throat. Yeah, so apparently we were slightly lied to. I only just found out from Dad this morning. Black's not he's not good, but he's not the Dursleys, Harry says. He's been decent to me. Told me a bunch of stories about my parents and their friends, and he definitely did give me permission to meet up with you lot in Diagon Alley. So long as he was there to supervise too, making sure we didn't get into any trouble, you know. Oh, Hermione frowns. Well, that sounds reasonable. Mum didn't think so, Ron explains. She said she'd sooner ship us all out of Britain than let any one of us near a bloody Death Eater. Death Eater? But I researched the trials. Sirius Black was declared innocent. Hermione, Ron groans. You've really got to stop with this trusting all authorities thing of yours. You don't understand. He hesitates. All the Death Eaters that walk free today, they only do so because they had irrefutable proof against their involvement to present to the court. Considering how it was in those times, all the darkness and the paranoia, it would have been impossible for them to stay away from Azkaban otherwise. For Malfoy, it was somehow finding a way to lie under Veritaserum. No one can do that. Trained Aurors can maybe withhold facts, but you can't lie outright like he did, so that got him free. Avery he had 4 whole eyewitnesses speaking in his favor, all of them in high government positions, which triumphed testimonies from the working-class witnesses who happened to catch sight of him with his mask off once or twice on the streets. Then there was not now he had 13 witnesses speaking against him, powerful people closely affiliated with Dumbledore, plus his fellow members of the Wizengamot. So he was convicted, then? Hermione asks with wide eyes, never having looked anywhere near as interested in Ron's words as she does now. The witnesses were protected by the Aurors day and night leading up to the trial, they were. Don't tell me they all mysteriously vanished off the face of the earth or something, Hermione gasps. God, this is just like my mum's true crime documentaries. Your mum's what? I never mind. Anyways, they all made it into the courtroom safely. And everyone was so relieved, you know? Because all 18 witnesses actually had disappeared when it came to Lestrange's first trial, so. Oh my God. But no, this group of witnesses were all fine. Then they got to the podium one by one, all of them either close friends with Dumbledore or members of families that had been affiliated for generations, and every one of them started lying through their teeth. What? It's Harry who speaks up this time. He hadn't even known Theo's father was a Death Eater. Well, sure, he'd guessed as much, seeing as he seemed to be a regular acquaintance of Black's. But since Harry had never really heard of him before, he'd assumed Lord Nott was not quite as avid of a member of the Death Eaters as the others were, if that was even a thing. Like, maybe he just made a donation to Voldemort's cause or something. Surely nothing bad enough to warrant the existence of a whopping 13 eyewitnesses who were willing to insist otherwise, until that changed, apparently. They swore they must have seen wrong, that they were confused in the midst of the war, that the terror had addled their minds, all of them, so convincing, so earnest. But the Ministry was desperate to have Nott behind bars. He was dangerous, everyone knew that. So obviously they called in the Aurors and checked for traces of confundus charms and stuff. And healers were brought in to see if there were any potions in their systems, nothing. These people who had been loyal to the Order's cause from the very start just flipped. Overnight. But why? Hermione whispers. No one knows, Ron answers grimly. But that's why Nott remains free to this day. Getting back to the point, he insists, and Harry remembers why all this talk of Death Eaters was brought up in the first place. All the Death Eaters who managed to avoid Azkaban had actual evidence, or lack thereof, that declared them innocent to rational eyes. Black, though? Ron shakes his head. 13 people dead in one's curse. We know that about him because he never denied it. He didn't bother with covering it up, because he didn't have to. A street full of Muggle eyewitnesses, a dozen extra Wixen as well as testimonies from 2 Death Eaters insisting that Black had been you-know-who's right hand, and all he got was house arrest. How? Hermione exclaims. That's not right. It's not just. That's the Blacks for you. Ron sighs. They're the oldest family in magical Britain, and the most powerful, too, even now, in an entire decade past their prime. They've got their roots down in literally every pureblood family out there. The Weasleys are pretty closely related, actually, because my grandmother is Sirius Black's aunt. Seriously. Harry stares. You're related too, Harry. The Potters are as old as any sacred family. Though I'm not really sure just how you're related, it's only the posh and big-headed pureblood heirs that get taught things like that. Oh, who cares about that? What we need to focus on here is how you've just essentially told us that Harry's legal guardian is an actual Death Eater who was never convicted. Hermione cries. Now that Black is free, what if he tries to bring Voldemort back or something? What if he tries to kill Harry? Or worse, expelled? Harry grumbles under his breath, sarcasm and sass being regular coping mechanisms of his to deal with all the shit in his life. That's not funny. Hermione scowls, and makes a show of swinging her arm to swat a sniggering Ron over the head. Seeing this, Ron pulls off a successful dodge, only to stumble back and nearly trip over the sleeping man's feet in his escape. All 3 of them pause with their movements for a moment, tense as they wonder if the man will wake up. He doesn't, though, and goes right on back to snoring away. Who do you reckon he is? Ron wonders out loud. Professor R.J. Lupin. Hermione replies immediately. How do you know that? Hermione gives an unimpressed roll of her eyes. It's on his case. She points up at the luggage rack over the man's head, where there is a small, battered case held together with a large quantity of neatly knotted string. The name Professor R.J. Lupin is stamped across one corner in peeling letters. Looks a bit young to be a professor, doesn't he? Ron frowns, staring at the man's battered but clearly youthful face. Can't even be in his mid-30s yet. That would be around Lord Black's age, wouldn't it? Harry, you mentioned Black told you things about your parents' generation, Hermione says, turning to Harry. Magical Britain is a small place. If they're around the same age, Black, your parents, and Professor Lupin would have all attended Hogwarts at about the same time. Did he ever mention anything about Professor Lupin to you? Harry pauses as he tries to recall the name. There were fun anecdotes here and there about his mum and her best friend Mary. Stories touched by nostalgia involving his dad and his childhood friend Marlene. Slytherins by the names of Dorcas and Pandora who ended up joining the group, too, as well as students in the older years, like Neville's parents, because Frank and James always got along so splendidly. Nope, Harry shrugs, after a bit of consideration. The name never came up. Guess Black and Professor Lupin just never really got around to knowing each other. Oh, Hermione says, and appears a bit disappointed. Then she shakes her head. Getting back to the matter at hand. What are we going to do about this Death Eater problem? Focus. Ron, your best friend is more important than a pack of chocolate cauldrons. Ron and Hermione lapse back into their old bickering ways quite smoothly, and it's a relatively quiet ride after that. The afternoon darkens into evening, and soon, Hogwarts Castle is visible in the distance. In only a matter of minutes, Harry will be home again.